pronounced your name correctly. And
You did. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm very, very humbled by your presence and the privilege of your time. And my first question is, on July 17, Dawn did a very courageous thing, which was to have a discourse with all the Biden officials who had resigned and issued a joint public statement regarding why they were resigning on the Biden's policy in Gaza. After a week of it, how do you see what are the challenges or what would be the socio-cultural, political, or legal impact of voices of conscience?
Well, I think it is a very important signal to the American public, to the Biden administration, that there is a great deal of internal discord within the State Department, within the executive branch, about America's policies in Gaza. I don't remember ever seeing such a large number of senior officials resigning from an administration in protest over that administration's policies. Honestly, the last I can remember was during the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, in the early 2000s and 2003, when I think a small number of officials resigned. I think that the resignations, which are now 12 people and by some estimates 16 people, are a very important signal of the changing public opinion on Israel-Palestine, but also because so many of the resigners are people who've been working in the administration for over a decade, really just mounting frustration and disgust with America's unconditional support to Israel, notwithstanding its apartheid rule, notwithstanding its illegal occupation. But I think they really reached a breaking point, and a red line was crossed with Israel's most recent incursions and war in Gaza, and the conclusion of so many international commentators, including the International Court of Justice, that Israel's conduct of this war is genocidal. So while these administration officials may have been able to tolerate a lot for many years, there was a red line that was crossed, and that red line has been Israel's continued deliberate attack on Palestinian civilians.
And what do you, how will these officials manage their safety because of the surveillance or the deep state or the AIPAC lobby, which will be now scrutinizing them, or the kind of hate speech they would face? How would they safeguard themselves?
You know, fortunately, in the United States, we are not yet at a point where breaking with the government or publicly criticizing Israel makes people a target of political violence, like the assassinations, like the attacks, physical attacks on opposition politicians, even in India, which I'm sure your audience will be familiar with, or Pakistan or Bangladesh, as we've seen in recent weeks. However, so while I don't think their personal security is at risk, I think their professional security, their financial security, their community security is at risk because there is such a high price to pay for those who criticize Israel's policy. And the more of a profile you have, the more of a senior professional that you are, the more will be the attacks against you. I think that the pro-Israel advocacy community and lobbyists and agents of the Israeli government have still been quite circumspect in directly attacking the people who resign from the government, because after all, they have been until very recently members of the US government. But I know that some of them are struggling to find new jobs and are trying to figure out where they can fit in professionally and personally as people who've been really lifelong civil service government employees.
Yeah. Especially with the elections coming up and their stand, the ethical stand being much more clearer. It is a tough time. But once again, I would like to congratulate you and the entire team for hosting that. Now, I would like to ask you questions regarding how, when we are talking about safety. Uh, you have been facing consistent political rhetoric, and what I've figured out is by especially very strong men. Like men in positions of power, be it journalism law, um, in terms of having this anti-Israel bias whenever you try to bring the question of human rights abuse. There are times when your keywords have been timed, that how many times are you mentioning Hamas or Hezbollah, and how many times are you mentioning Israel. You have been consistently, there is a certain kind of a machinery, I would not just say a few people, but a systematic machinery which is working against you constantly to, you know, just waiting for you to make one mistake, or even if it's not a mistake, to construe it as a mistake for the public opinion. So at a personal level, how do you deal with that?
I would say pretty easily, I think, relative to other peers who are newer to the social media scene and the very rough and tumble world of public discourse. You know, Americans fight their fights most typically with words, at least intercommunally, I should say. And social media is a platform where we're globally fighting with words. I have been doing this kind of work and been on the front line of advocating for Palestinian rights to have gained a very early familiarity with the kinds of attacks that are made against people like me, that are made against people who criticize Israel's policies unapologetically, without caveating it and softening it and gentling it and melting it to make it palatable to Israel and its supporters. And so, frankly, I've grown a little bit more tough-skinned to recognize that I am perfectly comfortable ignoring these kinds of attacks. You know, as you rightly use the word machinery, this is in fact a machinery, and many of the attacks on social media, particularly on Twitter, are frankly paid for and purchased electronic armies. In some cases, AI bots, fake profiles, fake personas that are part of the architecture of the Israeli government to challenge and suppress speech critical of Israel. And frankly, I think I'm at the lucky end of things because I don't have bullets coming my way. I'm not being starved of food the way that Palestinian children or Gaza are. I don't have massive buildings collapsing on my head like the women of Gaza are. Most of the time, I frankly laugh it off. My colleagues always urge me not to engage or not to respond, even to mock or make fun of some of the attackers against me. It's very hard to do. But I really feel pretty toughened by my experience over many decades pushing for Palestinian rights. And it's something that people don't want to hear. It's something that many want to muffle in silence. And so they use dirty tricks to try to do that. And it hasn't worked. I mean, I think that professionally, it's certainly been a challenge. I can't imagine that the Biden administration would hire someone like, although I feel like I'm eminently qualified to work in a foreign policy position for my government on behalf of my government. So there's certain professional prices one pays in terms of a career in government or a career in institutions that studiously avoid having anyone who's too critical of Israel in their view. But you know, that's partly why Dawn exists. It's to give people an institutional home where they can speak openly and honestly about US foreign policy and about US support for abusive regimes in the Middle East, because that is where our own attention is focused on. You note those who, what we call the bean counters, the people who will literally count the words, the number of tweets, the number of posts on other social media of my own and of my organizations. And they've been doing this for a very long time. They did this while we were at Human Rights Watch. You had gongo fake organizations like NGO Monitor documenting how many words Human Rights Watch issued on Israel versus the other 19 countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Frankly, I think even if we look at a pro rata distribution of the number of people Israel has killed versus the number of people Hamas has killed, I would say that my tweets pro rata are a good, appropriate balance of where responsibility lies for the gruesome and grotesque atrocities we are seeing perpetrated today. Let me be very clear, frankly, it's perhaps even insulting to have to be required to repeat this like a trained parrot. But all attacks on civilians are wrong. All attacks on civilians are worthy of condemnation. And I condemn Hamas's attacks on civilians, Hezbollah's attacks on civilians, et cetera, and so on. But I am an American citizen, and my first responsibility, my primary responsibility, my duty as an American citizen is to try to stop the abuses that my own government is contributing to, that my own taxpayer dollars are contributing to. My government is not supporting Hamas. My government is not supporting Hezbollah. My government is supporting Israel in its wildly.
So as I was talking, because now the attacks are not about just, on Twitter or just on your social media or about just safety. It is also through Pegasus and how your entire data privacy is being intruded upon without your knowledge. And the problem with social media, we have the former CEO of WhatsApp, John Coombe, if I'm pronouncing his name right, he donated a massive amount of money in billions of dollars to AIPAC. So how do you see the US presidential campaign, whoever it might be, to be devoid of these kinds of cash inflows?
Multiple questions that need to be addressed. So first of all, in terms of Pegasus and surveillance and spying and attacks, fortunately, or perhaps problematically, it appears that Pegasus and NSO Group, the Israeli government created company that prepares and sells this surveillance software, had some kind of an agreement never to spy on American telephone numbers, never to infect the phone of American phone numbers. And that's why if you scrutinize closely, you will find that the American journalists or activists whose phones have been targeted by Pegasus were not using an American phone number. So as long as I'm using an American phone number, at least I'm a little bit safer from NSO Group. That doesn't mean that my phone and the phones of my colleagues and our communications are not in some manner, shape, or form surveilled, monitored, and tracked. And I think that for activists and journalists, we generally presume that our communications will be surveilled if they haven't already, and to proceed accordingly with caution and to a certain extent with a great deal of confidence in what we're doing privately as what we're doing publicly, and that's a level of transparency I'm not uncomfortable with. Nevertheless, I think you're right to put your finger on the expanded suppression of speech and civil society in the United States, and the extent to which Israel and its supporters, including its agents in the United States, are actively working to pass laws that will formally impose sanctions, legislative sanctions, punitive sanctions, even criminal sanctions on Americans who criticize Israel. And that is something that terrifies me greatly, because we know are feckless members of Congress who care more about their continued financial donations from AIPAC than they do about American rights and freedoms, have been willing to entertain legislation that will prohibit Americans from criticizing Israel, that will label them as anti-Semitic if they criticize Israel, for example, as a racist apartheid state, which it is, and will impose sanctions and penalties on them. I am concerned about American legislative efforts that are now proposing to strip American civil society organizations of their charitable status, of their nonprofit status, if they are deemed to be critical of Israel in a way that is interpreted as supporting terrorism. So, for example, if you criticize Israeli atrocities in Gaza, therefore you support Hamas, therefore you support terrorism. And it's disgusting to me that these arguments are actually making ground, achieving ground in US Congress right now. That is on top of state laws and sanctions that have been imposed already on Americans who want to boycott, who want to support a boycott of Israel. They have been fired from their jobs. They've lost advertising revenues. They've lost contracts with states and city municipalities because of that kind of speech. This is not only dangerous to American rights and freedoms to speak about Israel, it's a larger danger to American rights and freedoms more broadly, because what we've seen is the copycats, the fossil fuel industry, the mining industry, the tobacco industry, the guns lobby. They're all copying Israel's playbook to pass their own laws and rules and sanctions on prohibitions on Americans who would criticize them or call for a boycott against them. So it's a very dangerous path that our government is going on. I'm disappointed is far too mild a word for me to use with respect to the Biden administration's failure to stop this. Its apparent willingness to burn our Constitution into ashes, to burn down our First Amendment rights, if it means satisfying the Israel lobby and protecting Israel from criticism. This is, from my perspective, a great treason against the American people.
It's very courageous of you to publicly say it also, and to mention about the kind of supposed freedom that American phone numbers have, but we never know. And but so how do you, with Kamala Harris being officially endorsed, how do you see, she was not present when on July 25th, Netanyahu gave the Congress address. I think it's his fourth time. And she was not present, and she called for a two-state solution. But do you think that US is ready to have a first female president? And second, that Kamala Harris would really make a difference? Because two-state policy has many challenges. And would she just be some kind of copycat of, or a model of what Frantz Fanon used to say, black skin white mask?
Yeah. Again, several questions here. First of all, is America prepared for a woman or a woman of color to be president? I think that many Americans, probably a majority of Americans, are ready. But I am ashamed to say that many Americans, if not a majority, a sizable percentage, are not ready for a woman, and are certainly not ready for a woman of color to be president. And it's 2024, and we're still talking about this. It's 2024, and Kamala Harris still feels the need to appoint a white male to be her vice president, because that's the only way you can have a palatable ticket, because it's still an issue. For example, what if she had a female running late? What if a woman was running with her? What if a Black man was running with her? What if a Latino man was running with her? Why are these still issues in 2024 in America? I wish they weren't. It's disappointing that other countries have made advances on gender equality, on having a woman head of state, and the United States is still far behind. And To be honest, I don't quite understand it because I don't see that level of discrimination and scrutiny against women in so many other fields in the United States where there is a more normalcy to women leadership. But yes, it remains an issue. And I think that will absolutely dictate her selection of what I am extremely confident will be a white male running mate. I hate that kind of representational positioning, but it's sadly very much alive in the United States today. As for Kamala Harris's policies with respect to Israel, I have seen nothing to date that would suggest that she has any understanding or vision of US policy in the Middle East that is significantly at odds with the failed approach of the Biden administration or the Trump administration or the Obama administration before it. I mean, the America's catastrophic support for Israel, it transcends party lines, and it has been in place for many decades. This is never an issue. Any foreign policy issue is never an issue on which Vice President Harris built her career on, or sought to be engaged in, or has ever been vocal on. And she has, by and large, touted the party line, the Democratic Party line. Now, she has on occasion made comments a little bit more critical of Israel than President Biden or his immediate staff. I think that's by design, not by accident or serendipity. I think she's been trotted out to appease the American public, the Democratic voting public, who is so upset with the Biden administration, by throwing them a few words of consolation here and there and making someone who doesn't set policy say critical things of Israel. And I think that strategically and politically, some of the comments she made in the immediate wake of Netanyahu's visit, refusing to attend his speech, although she met with him privately, is a political strategy to create a little bit of space and distance between her and President Biden's support for Israel, which could well end up costing the Democratic Party the election in November, because a large swath of the Democratic base is very angry at the Democratic Party. And this is a swath, this is a base that votes. It is the progressive base of the party that decides if they are going to clinch the vote. It is the Muslim Americans in swing states, Arab Americans in swing states, that can determine the outcome of this election. And I think the Democratic Party understands that, which is why they've tried to throw us a few bones, appease us here and there. Now, Kamala Harris playing it safe, trying to distance herself a little bit, but not quite. I have not seen anything to suggest that she's going to fundamentally rethink America's approach of providing military and political support to abusive regimes in the Middle East.